All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are joined today by Justin Roberts, who is Associate Professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He specializes in the study of slavery in the British Empire. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 2009, and he is the author of Slavery and the Enlightenment in the British Atlantic, 1750 to 1807, published in 2013, and of many published articles and book chapters on the rise of racism and plantation slavery. His articles have appeared in several journals, including the William and Mary Quarterly, Early American Studies, and the Journal of Interdisciplinary History and the Journal of Global Slavery. And so we will be hearing more about his latest book today, Fragile Empire. He will be joined in conversation by Dexnell Peters, who is lecturer in Caribbean and Atlantic History at the University of the West Indies, the Mona campus. He received his PhD in Atlantic History from Johns Hopkins University. And Peters is broadly interested in the history of the Greater Caribbean and the Atlantic world. His current research project, through the main themes of geography and the environment, inter-imperial transitions, migration, the plantation economy, politics and religion, makes a case for the rise of a greater Southern Caribbean region, inclusive of Venezuela and the Guianas, in the late 18th century, showing evidence for a very polyglot, cross-imperial, and interconnected world. And with Shane Panten, he is the author of The Guild of Students at UWI, St. Augustine, 1962 to 2012. And so I hope everyone will join me in welcoming Justin and Dexnell, and I will turn it over to you all for a conversation.
Great. Thank you very much, Amanda, for the introduction. And I mean, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I mean, as you might have noticed, I'm on the back cover of the book. I mean, I had the pleasure to read it and give some comments. And I mean, I agree. I felt that it was a very fascinating and kind of masterfully kind of crafted global history of the tropical, early English tropical sort of empire. And I found it interesting that so many other people kind of commented in the book, said the same words. So we're all in agreement, right? That this is a kind of very masterfully kind of crafted work. So looking forward to kind of just getting into it. And so let me just sort of start off with, especially for those who may not have, gotten a chance to read the book yet. Justin, can you just kind of briefly tell us what this book is about?
Sure. And I want to thank you, Dexnell, for doing this today. I really appreciate it, and Amanda for hosting this. It's wonderful to have someone to moderate and comment who I know is going to be friendly to the book to begin with. So this is a study of the rise of slavery across the globe in the English Empire, and I think it's one of the first books to do that. And so I'm traditionally a Caribbean specialist, but I thought I want to stop thinking about slavery as an Atlantic entity alone. And I started realizing that there were forms of coarse slavery and coarse labor and slavery appearing across this early English empire. And I kept coming across this, and thought, okay, I need to write a book about the rise of slavery across the entire English empire. Now, that'd be far too difficult to do. And so I decided I need a new sort of more narrow geographical construct. And so I focused on the tropics, which is to some extent an invented category, invented by people at the time. But I focused on a tropical empire. And why that? Well, it struck me that everywhere I looked across this tropical empire, as I started doing research on this early English empire and the rise of slavery, there were enslaved majorities at every single site all across the empire by the end of the 1600s, virtually every single site. So the English weren't migrating there. This was an empire being built on the backs of coarse labor and enslaved people, an empire that was reliant entirely on non-Europeans to defend it, to populate it, to build it, etc., and to support it. And I thought, well, this is an incredibly fragile empire, which isn't fitting with some of what I've read recently in other sites. And so there's two things I want to do with this book. Is I want to talk about the rise of slavery across the entire English empire, why that's occurring particularly in the tropics, and why we need to think about this beyond the Atlantic world. And I wanted to talk about the nature of this early empire, and what I argue is a distinctly different model of empire, and that's what I call the slave empire. The fact that this occurs everywhere across this tropical zone for epidemiological reasons, for ideological reasons, for sort of demographic reasons. There's a wide variety of reasons I discuss in the book. Epidemiology is a big one for me. So I re-explore that older argument we've seen before. But then I say, look, as a result of this, we have an empire in which these 17th century sites are often collapsing. people organizing these sites become terrified of both insurrection and invasion at all points. They're forced, as I said, to rely on the people. And ultimately, sort of interestingly, when I talk about the book, forced to rely increasingly on arming enslaved people to defend this empire, which at first they're at odds with. But ultimately, it becomes sort of a greater fear of invasion than insurrection, simply because of the amount of profits to be made across this tropical zone. So that's the book in a nutshell.
Wow, that's great. I mean, then I suppose one of the things I want to kind of jump on next is this transition from, as you describe yourself, sort of focusing more on the Caribbean and then taking it towards the kind of globe, right? So, I mean, I think that the way you do that is quite seamless, right? You talk about the Barbados model, and the plantation system that emerges across the Caribbean as well, the early English Caribbean. But the thing that really strikes me is the way you're taking that argument even beyond, people like Jack Green, right? Barbados is a kind of cultural heart of the Americas and so on. But you're really kind of trying to make the claim of the Barbados or, the early English Caribbean as this model for the wider Caribbean, right? For this kind of global empire. And I thought, can I get you to kind of talk about that a little bit more? And,
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm a Barbadian specialist at heart,
Right.
as most people know, and so it's perhaps easy for me to see Barbados everywhere I look. But I started off by writing about the early Caribbean. Well, my first book was about the 18th century, and it was about sort of slave plantations in the 18th century. But I turned more towards the early Caribbean for an article I'd done in the William Mary Quarterly, and I talked about a Barbadian diaspora. And I started coming up with this concept of Barbados spreading everywhere. And then in the midst of that, I started writing a book that compared the development of slavery legally in the Caribbean and on the mainland. And I pitched this book to Cambridge, and they signed me up, and I wrote the entire book. I actually have a shadow book out there.
Right.
And I decided not to publish it. I didn't like it. I didn't think I had anything really new to say.
Right.
But as I was writing that, and as I was researching the 17th century, I kept coming across these references to enslaved people coming from the Indian Ocean and being at sites across the Indian Ocean. And I started pushing into that and exploring the EIC and the VOC. And my lectures, I teach a lecture every year at Dalhousie on the Atlantic world. My lectures began to expand into sort of our global history. And so it wasn't just Atlantic world anymore. It was early modern world increasingly. I was talking to the students about Sumatra rather than simply Jamaica. And I thought, I need to write about this. I need to start digging into who's writing about this. And I came across some people, certainly, who were starting to write about slavery in the East India Company and in the Indian Ocean. And they talked about the tyranny of the Atlantic and slave studies. And they talked about how extensive coerced labor was at these Indian Ocean sites. Michael Bennett had done some great work on this to begin with. And I'd seen some of his work, and I thought there's a more interesting story. There's a much larger story. And he ended up publishing an article in Atlantic Studies on the reliance on Barbadian models at St. Helena. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. So the East India Company, because James Drax was a founder of the East India Company, was also involved in the creation of the Barbadian plantation system. The East India Company is drawing on Caribbean models. I wonder how much broader this is, how much more widespread it is. And as I started looking everywhere, I started seeing these references to Barbados again and again. The Barbadian model. We can do this like Barbados. We can build plantations like Barbados. Look how much wealth is being created in Barbados. And it struck me, though, that everywhere else I looked around the empire, there were obviously very different models of slavery. The English were these sort of opportunists, veteran opportunists, I say, where they're taking advantage of vulnerable people wherever they can. They're enslaving them whatever ways they can. But by the 1680s, it struck me that pretty much everywhere we looked, there was this one consistent, very draconian, very inflexible model of slavery that emerged across the empire. And it was the model that we first see in the Caribbean. And I was thinking about older arguments about how that had spread up to Virginia and that had reshaped sort of Virginian models of slavery, which were sort of more Iberian to begin with. By 1670, by 1675, there's this much more hardened form. I thought, well, that's occurring everywhere across the empire. And so, one of the things I argue here is that the Barbadian model inspires people to try to develop plantations everywhere. Particularly sugar plantations. We're going to see this in Madagascar. We're going to see this in Sumatra. We're going to see this, everywhere else the English start looking to settle. But this Barbadian model of hardened slavery also gets exported elsewhere through the empire. and then the plantations in general. So this is a side note. We can talk about this later if we want, but I started thinking about the plantation complex and realized that the plantation complex, we've often argued, has only a westward trajectory. Think about Philip Curtin's older work, the plantation complex moves in the Caribbean. It doesn't. It strikes me that it's going all over the place, and there's all kinds of different models of plantations being formed, particularly the Barbadian model is the most profitable. But when the Dutch occupy Brazil, and sugar prices are destabilized, there's sugar being grown, obviously, to the Lesser Antilles after that. That's where it takes off in the islands of Lesser Antilles. It also starts getting grown in Java, around Batavia, and in Sumatra, and in oddly enough in Taiwan. And these places are growing sugar in order to supply or fill the economic vacuum in sugar production on a global scale. And so we have this kind of narrow lens sometimes, I think, with the Atlantic world, myself included. I've contributed that, but we need to think much more broadly about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. But I want to kind of push this point about the kind of link between Barbados and the kind of wider world, because you have scholars that historians. I'm thinking about we know Philip Morgan talking about the Caribbean has the dubious distinction of being the first region in the Americas that introduced slavery sugarcane plantation system. Nowhere was the influence of this unholy trinity more systematically and intensely felt than the Caribbean. It was clearly the focal point of the overseas expansion in the early modern world. We have Alan Carras talking about the Caribbean as the first area Europeans encountered, and it ought to be considered a crucible for understanding many of the modern world's historical processes. And to me, a lot of that argument has kind of been centered in the West a bit, right? And would you say you're really kind of expanding that even more, and the significance is being drawn on an even more kind of global scale? Would that be a way of summing it up?
I think so. I've started to realize since writing the book and thinking about the global plantation more broadly that it is a Barbadian model, yes, and there's particular elements of Barbados that are important. So in St. Helena, for example, as Michael Bennett has written about, they bring in the Barbadian slave code in order to try to use the Barbadian slave code. And I found in Madras, they're making efforts to how to manage slaves, and they should do it on the Barbadian system, on the Barbadian style. They do the same thing in Sumatra. They start sending Barbadian overseers out into the Indian Ocean to grow sugar. So there's this idea somehow that the Barbados model is an incredibly successful model that should be replicated. They try this obviously in Madagascar, it doesn't work very well. But it's not just a Barbadian model. The Dutch are doing this as well. They're drawing to some extent on what they've learned in Brazil. I know there's been a movement in literature to downplay the Dutch influence in Barbados, but as I'm thinking more broadly, I'm realizing the Dutch have a lot of influence in spreading this plantation model, partly because they're doing it themselves. So, if you look at the Banda Islands, the Dutch come into the Banda Islands, shortly after the creation of the VOC, and they're battling with the English over the Banda Islands. And what do? Well, they kill off the vast majority of the population of the Banda Islands, and they bring in slaves, and they start growing nutmeg and creating nutmeg plantations. And the English right away start saying, well, we need plantations. We need to organize and create our own plantations. And these are not necessarily always European-run plantations, but they're sometimes European encouraged plantations. So you're going to see in the 1630s, the English East India Company starts encouraging Chinese entrepreneurs to grow sugar around Batavia. And so this is alongside the development of sugar in Barbados. And then, of course, what happens is we have a kind of snowball effect. Once Barbados takes off, everyone realizes it's a really important model and they start using it elsewhere. But it's a model of exploitation. It's a model of the extension of plantation agriculture. It's a model we can easily associate with sort of the expansion of capitalism. There's scholars that have pointed to this. It's a model we can associate with the rise of slavery. And it's a model that Barbados experiences the repercussions of first, so the sort of slave empire.
Right.
They have to start to deal with what do you do with a massive enslaved majority. What do you do with kind of the deforestation, the environmental degradation? What do you do with the constant threat of being invaded by other European powers who want this profitable island? They have to go through that. What do you deal with, the decline? I talk about this in the book, the decline in the number of white migrants. They're not going to come to these areas anymore. And then what effect does this have? This Barbados becomes one of the first places in which we witness the globalization of forced labor markets, right, on a massive scale, and the movement of the plantations. And so it becomes the pinnacle of something I'm discussing, and it certainly becomes an example that gets drawn upon. But it's a much broader phenomenon. I think beyond just Barbados. So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, so I mean, you're kind of saying it goes beyond kind of trying to anchor down to a particular space. And I mean, I know we have lots of people who focused in Atlantic history, but sort of emulation. And so a lot of these things are just being, so we can't even connect it to kind of geographical space or, imperial zone or something like that, right? Sort of going.
Yeah.
I get that significantly. I mean, keeping this focus on the kind of global scale of things, right? So you have this conceptualization of a kind of early embryonic global English empire. I mean, I suppose how globally cohesive or interconnected, and I suppose that's one of the big questions people talk about the British Empire, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is where it's really interesting because it's so much of it is not state driven, right? It's driven by private initiative. It's driven by these, by these companies and by these investors in this early era. That the state just doesn't have the financial power to organize and run this in the 17th century. The way, although there's been a lot more emphasis in recent literature on sort of metropolitan interventions, or we're starting. I've done that myself. We're talking about metropolitan intervention, the shaping of the empire, but it's really weak. But what is interesting is that the people involved in creating the Atlantic Empire are also involved in creating commercial connections and colonization efforts in the Indian Ocean. And I'm not going to call what the English are doing in the 17th century in the Indian Ocean an empire. I'm reluctant to even necessarily call that the Americas at that point up until towards the end of the 17th century. But it's this effort at establishing English control over these regions, a sense of the need to maintain English identity in these regions. And there's a lot of talk about that. How do we make this place English? How do we maintain the Englishness? There seems to be somewhat of an English fear of the development of an Indo-Portuguese community that they see in the Indian Ocean. They say, okay, we don't want our people to slip off in this way and lose their Englishness. And so there's this creation of a common English empire. I'm going to call it that. Definitely going to call it a small E empire. But what's striking is that the individuals involved in this, the Royal African Company and the East India Company, are a few blocks apart in the same district of London, and these people are talking all the time. They're sitting in the same coffee houses. They're exploring ways of profiting across the empire, and who can be exploited and who can be traded with. And so you have people like, as I mentioned before, James Drax being involved in both the development of Barbadian sugar and being involved in the East India Company. I mean, these are important. And I talk about the example in the book of William Dampier. So I was doing some work on early Jamaica, and I came across Dampier, and of course, much has been written about him because he's a celebrated early English pirate. I thought, okay, he's working as an overseer at Bybrook. He's not interested in being an overseer. This is from the Helyar papers. It's an incredibly rich collection of 17th century Jamaican papers. And then he disappears, because he's not really doing a good job. I thought, well, where does he go? I don't know a lot about Dampier. I'm not a 17th century specialist. And I realized, whoa, Dampier is then traveling to Bencoolen in Sumatra. I mean, after doing some raiding in the Spanish Main and then raiding of Danish slave ships, he's traveling to Bencoolen. Then he's traveling to Madras and he's buying slaves, or a slave, who he brings back to London. I thought, these are people who are moving all around the globe. And so it becomes this sort of common reference point. One of the best examples I discovered of this was when I talked about slave resistance. And I said, well, isn't it interesting that the largest slave rebellion of the 17th century at an East India Company site happens in Sumatra. They run away. It's a mass maroonage, and they run to the jungle, and it's a few people killed along the way. And it's very shortly after that there's conspiracy to rebel in St. Helena. And the conspiracy to rebel, as they sort of investigate it never turns out to be much, but they talk about how two sailors who had arrived, which I think they may have arrived given the trade routes from the Indian Ocean, were talking about how there were these uprisings all across other English sites. And wasn't it striking that there were no uprisings in St. Helena? And supposedly they had been overheard by a slave who then planned a rebellion. I talk about this in the book. And I say, so these sailors themselves are thinking about slave revolts in the English Empire as a global phenomenon and comparing them and thinking about how to suppress and control them. And that in itself may be driving further rebellion. So it's this big picture we need to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I find that really interesting. And I mean, as you've kind of brought up slavery, I mean, which is the heart of the book, I want to kind of get to that. But before, I mean, just to kind of comment, I mean, you're sort of talking about the strength of individuals in a sense, right? Because you mentioned this
Yes.
empire was a little e, not so much a kind of
Yes.
big E, right? But, I'm thinking about, imperial careering, right? And all these people are kind of moving around, officials, but these individuals, right? Merchants, factors, whatever
Yeah.
it might be. And the strength of how that, they're kind of pushing this sort of English culture. I mean, I suppose I want to ask about that before I kind of pigeonhole into talking about slavery. I mean, you mentioned in the book, that this is really going to focus more on the English Empire, right? By 1707, you have the Act of Union, etc. And, over time, you're going to get to talking about a sort of British Empire, right? But I suppose, I don't know, the question is how much does this continue to, even after 1707 and beyond, continue to be a sort of English empire, would you say?
I mean, there's been a lot of work done on the role of the Scots and the expansion of the empire. We know this, and this effectively after 1707, the Scots become kind of the vanguard of empire, and of course they're particularly disproportionately represented amongst overseers and plantation owners and so on in the Americas. So that we can think about the Scots being heavily involved in that. And so what I might say is I decided to focus on the English Empire in part because I didn't want to get into that larger phenomenon. There's a lot more going on. And so this is a way of me dividing and cutting down the work and saying, okay, I'm going to focus, I'm already taking a global perspective. I'm going to focus on English alone. One of the I think important pushbacks I got was, well, what about these other empires?
Right.
What about the Portuguese? What about the Dutch? What are we seeing? And is it the same phenomenon emerging? Is it the same reliance on slavery? Is it the same fragile empire? And my argument would be, aside from some significant differences, yes, it is. We're seeing this everywhere. We can see, as I said, the Dutch developing plantations in the Indian Ocean. The Dutch have a significant slave trade going on there. And we can see the French in the Mascarene Islands in the 1720s, developing sugar plantations that are rivaling some of what we're seeing in Saint Domingue. So, I mean, these empires are all more global than we've described, and the development of slavery is all more global than we've described. And so, I guess I might say, not only should I also be talking about other people in that empire, in the English Empire, but I really should be talking about all sorts of empires. And to some extent, I'm doing that. I'm writing a paper right now on the spread of the global plantation complex, and giving a paper on that in Philadelphia in May at the Where is Early America conference, and trying to address some of those questions because they have been eating away at me as well. Thinking, all right, yeah, I need to do more comparison. I'm always drawn to these larger comparisons.
No, I mean, and as you said, there are practical reasons why we have to do things as well. But I suppose it will provide a sort of excellent basis for comparison, right? So someone can do this with, the Scottish component to something and kind of compare it against your book as well. So they're practical, but also useful, right?
Yeah, this is the first step. This is me trying to get the discussion going, and I'm sure along the way, because the topic is so broad, I was learning as I was going. I had an atlas out beside me and Google Maps, throughout, trying to understand where these people are moving and what's going on. This is something that people will need to build on. I'm hoping to start a discussion as much as anything else. So this is a direction in which we need to move.
Well, I think a very important conversation to kick off, right? Sort of slowly transition to talking about slavery, right? Which is at the heart of the book. And I was really struck by your section to begin with on language and terminology, right? And you talk about, the nuance of, there's debate between enslaved and slave versus slave, enslaver versus master, and so on. And you kind of try to strike a fairly delicate balance between. So I wondered if I could get you to kind of talk about that. Just to add, I was reading James Burns' article in the recent article, Transactions of the Royal Society, and he's talking about how, we don't necessarily see historians being as forthcoming, talking about terminology and providing justification and so on. So, I would say that's certainly one plus of this book, right? And the way you're kind of doing that. But you talk about
I appreciate that. That was one of the very last revisions I made. And it's because as I was presenting on the book, and when I received my first round of readers' reports, I had a lot of pushback and people saying that I should not be using the word slave and the word master. And I started off with being concerned about the word master because I thought, okay, this book was born initially, as I said, of a legal history of slavery in the Caribbean, a legal history. And I thought, okay, legally speaking, when they're talking about masters, they don't just mean masters of slaves, they mean masters of households. They mean a master of everything within that domain, including the servants, including the slaves, including the wife and the family. And I thought, okay, so this is a reference to a very particular patriarchal order that we're losing if we don't use that term master anymore, because it's about a broader system of hierarchies and inequalities in which the master is at the center of this. And so I thought, okay, I want to make sure I keep this word master, but also explain. And so I adopted the word enslaver. I was, as was suggested, at appropriate points. But I thought, no, this is a particular historical term, and I want to keep true to those historical terms. And then I thought about the term slavery as well. And I thought, well, it's odd. When I first started at Johns Hopkins, I attended a few of the plantation museums and recreated plantations and so on in the South. And I noticed even in 2003 and 2004 that they seem to be avoiding using the word slave.
Right.
They wanted to refer to people as laborers or as servants. And I thought, isn't it interesting that they're trying to do that? What are they trying to convey? Well, they're trying to create a more palatable past, and they're trying to avoid the negative connotations of that word, and create a more rosy image. And I thought, well, slave has really dark and horrific connotations. We know that. We all understand that. And that's one of the reasons why in this sort of white slaves memes you see online, it's being reappropriated and used again. People are saying, okay, well, here we go. These Irish are slaves too. And they're using the word slaves deliberately and intentionally to invoke that sort of, more negative connotation. And I thought, no, I want a book in which I make it clear who is a slave and who is not. And I want to think about that as a legal category and a term in this context. But I also recognize the value in stressing that these people are more than just slaves, and that there's more to their identity. And so I want to think about them as enslaved human beings. And so I use both words interchangeably at key moments. And I talk openly in this preface at the beginning of the book about why and when and how I will do that. It just strikes me that my goal is to recreate the past to the best of my abilities, and that includes using the terminology they were using. I saw this in the Indian Ocean as well. There were sites in the Indian Ocean where the English were concerned about holding slaves because the Mughal Empire was opposed to the English holding slaves for a period of time, or holding Muslim slaves. And so the English would sometimes argue the person they had wasn't a slave, but a servant.
Right.
And then there would be debates over whether or not they were a slave, something I talk about in the book. And I thought, okay, in this context, that category really matters. It matters at that point in time, and it matters to us now. And it matters particularly when I have that third chapter where I talk about the definition of slavery. And that's where I really start exploring where and when that term is being used and in what context. There's a wonderful example from Java, from 1671, in which people are bought from the Portuguese and they're taken to Java, and the instructions are, do not treat them as slaves, treat them as human beings, and ensure that they are free after 7 years if they agree to convert to Christianity, which opens a sort of a whole wonderful can of worms that I try to explore in that chapter. So, well, if they're not slaves to begin with, then why are they not free? What is their status? Why is it so dependent upon conversion to Christianity? And then all of this is occurring before that sort of moment that I described in that book, that kind of 1680s, when things start to solidify across the empire in terms of one sort of more homogenous system of slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult kind of balance to kind of strike, right? With just talk with kind of terminology and so on. I mean, certainly I think it matters for like time period and so on, right? One of the things Burns talk about is that the concept of enslaved isn't as relevant in medieval Europe, for example, when people are potentially sort of enslaving themselves, right? And, and adopting terms in that way. But I mean, I want to get into, I mean, you started talking about that chapter about definitions of slavery. How do you define slavery? I mean, and can you tell us more about how you're defining it in the book? I mean, you're talking about, you're giving that example of the kind of loose, common conflated terms of people, between slave and servant and so on. So yeah, good for you to share a bit more on that with us.
So what really struck me as I was looking across the 17th century empire was how quickly and readily the English would force people to labor, whoever was available. It didn't matter necessarily if they were slaves or if they could be held as slaves or what their legal status was. It was a question of how much you could do to a vulnerable group of people and how vulnerable they were in that context or situation. And then slavery is just a term that starts to follow later on. And so it struck me that it was really, so in 1688, which I talk about in the book, I believe it's 1688, in Sumatra, they said we need more slaves. And I thought by this point, what do they mean by slaves? Because of course, most people in the Indian Ocean who are bound are debt laborers or debt, in debt bondage. They're enslaved by debt, we might say. Is that what they mean? And it became very confusing to me as I was looking at their inventories because they would have slaves listed alongside people who were debtors. And it occasionally be noted to be free at some point in time. So I thought, okay, so how permanent does slavery need to be in this period to be slavery? Do these people have opportunities for manumission? How much opportunities do they have? And who is being bought and sold? It struck me there are all kinds of people being bought and sold for different terms. We could even argue that as many people have, that prisoners of war and indentured service are being bought and sold. I don't think they're slaves. I really don't. And so one of the things that really disturbed me in all this, I wanted to explore in more depth, and this comes from that legal history, is to say, okay, the argument I often hear is, well, the Irish were slaves in the Americas too because they were bought and sold. I don't agree with the idea that they were bought and sold. What I disagree with is that they were slaves. We need to think more broadly about what the nature of slavery is and stop insisting, and I see this just being too broadly done, stop insisting that the chattel principle, the idea that somebody bought and sold, is a defining feature of slavery, because there's more to it than that. And so I go through this chapter and say, here's a lot of ways in which we can see variety across this English world. In terms of who is vulnerable, who can be enslaved, and who's not enslaved. On the West African coast and in Sumatra, we see people who are described as slaves asking for their pay. They want to be paid, and what they're asking for is payment above and beyond what would be used for provisions. And the companies, the East India Company, the Royal African Company, are aware of that. But they're saying, well, we haven't been paid yet. That's really striking to me because we don't often associate payment with slavery. I said, well, all right, so an enslaved person is not necessarily even someone who's paid or not paid. I mean, that's not central to the definition. There's something else going on here. And then I see people being freed all the time, and I see this sort of slippery usage between who is a servant, who is a slave, and really the emphasis seems to be much more on one's identity than on whether they're a slave. We see this, people being described by their racial identity much more than by their status of slave or not slave from a very early period, because that's a recognition of how much can be done to them as vulnerable people. This is before the creation of slavery as a legal category. And so what I end up doing in this is saying, all right, one of the most significant differences, I think, between slaves and others in this world is the denial of subjecthood. And so I said that subjecthood is a kind of protection granted to English people, or sometimes others, and that enslaved people are denied this subjecthood, so they don't have those legal protections. And so really that sort of gets me back into thinking about Orlando Patterson's definition of slavery, the sort of naval alienation, the removal from kinship and connection, and so it becomes a question of not whether someone is free or unfree, or whether someone is owned or not owned, but it comes down to a question of belonging and how much protection you can expect from that broader community. And so I end up arguing that chapter. I say, okay, well, without those protections, without that sense of belonging, with that sort of with that vulnerability, enslaved people become subject to dehumanization and to violence on a greater scale than other kinds of forced laborers in this context. And so then I really come back to a definition of slavery that's more dependent on this sort of extreme forms of violence, the extreme forms of dehumanization that come with the denial of belonging or denial of subjecthood.
I mean, it is so interestingly kind of ties in. I mean, we started off talking about sort of Barbados and the spread of the slave codes and so on. We see the kind of racialization of slavery in a new way, and how all of this is kind of being concretized and so on. I find I mean, it's really interesting. I feel like we've been talking a lot about sort of, the content of the book, and I want to kind of transition a little bit to, some kind of more practical issues and so on. So, I mean, to begin with, what did you find were some of the kind of biggest research and writing challenges you faced? Would you say?
Well, when I turned from writing that first book on legal history, number one is I just had to abandon the idea that I wanted to do anything with that book, and I had to reach out to my editor and say, "Listen, it's going to be an entirely different book." It was under contract, and so I had to convince them that it was okay to do an entirely different book, and I offered to give it to a different press and so on, and they said they still wanted it. And the second issue was we had this nasty pandemic, and so I had to suddenly figure out how to research East India Company slavery in the midst of a pandemic. But
Right.
thankfully, there was an Adam Matthews database that I could start using, but the university wouldn't buy it for me. They would give me money to go to London, but I couldn't get to London. I wanted to see the IOR records in London. So, I dug around as much as I could, and then finally managed to, as soon as I could fly, hop on a plane and go to London, wear my masks and so on. And take as many pictures as I could, because as we all struggle with, my university would only give me a handful of dollars to go there to begin
Right.
with. It was enough to
Yes.
it was enough to cover 2 weeks in the archives. So in 2 weeks in the archives, I think I took something like 8 to 10,000 pictures, and then I had to come back and figure out what to do with it. So that was the biggest challenge I faced, and then it was pouring through that material and trying to learn a whole new collection of sources, a whole new data set from what I'd worked with before. I've done a lot of work with plantation records, but I had never looked at the IOR records. And then beyond that, I thought, all right, I need to go beyond these IOR records and see what else I can find. So I begged and borrowed to get more money and dipped into my own pockets and went back over to the UK again to do a little more research and go to the Bodleian and so on and see what else I could find in different collections and what other sort of commentary I could find. So I parsed and parsed it together and pieced it together. But it's a challenge even to now. I still, as I look through that book, it's a book where I think my understanding of the Caribbean is very clear.
Right.
I think my understanding of the Indian Ocean is a little more sketchy, and that's something that I just have to accept in order to move into this area, in order to expand the conversation in this direction. And this is where I think sometimes we get afraid to move beyond our own specialty. We get afraid to sort of step into these broader frameworks, but we need to in order to get the discussion going there.
Yes.
And so, we have these kind of bulwarks and fortresses that are created around our regional specialties. And when you try to step into someone else's, they'll tell you about all the literature you've missed and all the things you've missed. And I'm sure I have. But I've made the best effort I can in the short period of time to try to understand the Indian Ocean and try to bring that into conversation with the Caribbean.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, it's very encouraging, I think, especially for people sort of making this transition from a first book into a second book, and you're not going to be experts. It's okay, kind of, not know it all, but you can kind of start a conversation. Do you have, and I suppose this might be my last question, do you have any sort of, extra tips for those making that transition from sort of first to second book? Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose you have to find something you're really fascinated in. And so, it might be easy on some level to write a second book based on what you know. It's easy to just, keep exploring, keep expanding. But I think it's a lot more fun to explore something you know nothing about and to try to put it together. And it might take more time, but there's an enthusiasm there, I find, with heading into something new. So, as you know, Dexnell, we started working on this collection on slavery and the environment that'll be published with UNC Press. And my contribution to that was to look at road building in Jamaica alongside road building in Scotland.
Yes,
say,
I've seen the paper you gave. Oh, yeah.
Right. These are the same kinds of processes being used to control rebellious populations in the mountains. And that was incredibly exciting because it gave me the opportunity to go to Scotland, sit in the archives, and try to understand, the Scottish context in the sort of early 18th century amidst these Jacobite rebellions, understand the Scottish, something I don't know anything about. At least, on a deeper level, I know a fair bit about the Jamaican Maroons, but being able to bring these into conversation was interesting for me.
Right.
As sort of a broader imperial process of controlling resistant populations of the margins.
Great. Well, I mean, I just want to say thank you so much, Justin. This has been a lot of
Thank
fun
you.
talking about the book. And I mean, as your endorsements have said, this is, a really interesting, masterful study. And I hope people go off and read it.
I
Hand over
really
to you,
appreciate it.
Amanda.
Yeah, so we have some time for questions now. As I said earlier, if you prefer, you can type out your questions in the chat and drop them in there and I can read them out. Or if you'd like to just ask your question, which we would welcome, you go ahead and raise your Zoom hand. So we've already got one up. And Jake, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, Justin. Nice to
Hi, Jake. How are
meet
you?
you. Good. I haven't read it yet, but I have it right here. So,
Fantastic. Glad to hear
yeah.
that.
So, could you say a word about um, intermediaries and sort of mercantile intermediaries, specifically tied to specific ethnic groups and what you encounter in the East? So I'm thinking of, in the sugar trade in the Atlantic, we have, for example, Sephardic Jewish merchants playing very specific
Right.
role. And I'm thinking of Ida Schroeder's work on the fact that the secondary refining of sugar is based in Amsterdam and a bit in Hamburg means that Jews have a very specific role in the re-export of sugar, at least towards the end of the 17th century. So there you have like a really, really specific role for a really, really specific group tied to specific things like the Navigation Acts and the nature of the Sephardic diaspora. So if you're sort of disaggregating how you think about the English 17th century empire from Barbados and from the Caribbean and globalizing it, what equivalents do you see there moving out of the Atlantic?
It's a good question. I suppose what I might say, is the equivalents are obviously very, very specific to the region, right? And one of the things you see along the coast of West Africa, as you see sort of West African, cabotiers, these sort of, these merchants who are going to be involved in trade and facilitating a relationship between the English slave castles and the broader community. And what's fascinating in that context is how much they're, I'll focus on them for a moment, how much they're working to play off the English against other different European groups along the coast, right? And so what they'll do is they're working to get their best deals. And what they'll do sometimes, I give this wonderful example where slaves will run away, castle slaves will run away from the slave coast castles. And they're captured by these West African merchants who will then offer them back to the English at a certain price, but also sell them to the Dutch if the Dutch will pay more, right? And so on one level, the English will say, well, we can't capture runaway slaves. We're not worried about it because these local merchants will capture them for us. But that doesn't mean they're going to get them back. These local merchants are, operating on their own. So they're supporting the English being that region as long as it's useful to them. And as I said, they're very conscious of the difference in European powers and who's more valuable and who's less valuable. And this is where I talk about the fragility of empire. So you have some of these, local West African elites explicitly telling the English, listen, we can take you when we please. We can wipe out your fort whenever we please. We allow you to be there because you're useful to us, because you're bringing in firearms and so on. And I think you see, similar things going on in the same context. And what's striking to me is how often these locals are going to assist the English in controlling their slaves. So in Sumatra, when these slaves rise up and run away, I talk about sort of one moment of massive resistance in the East India Company. The English can't really go after them. They immediately have to turn to locals and say, listen, can you help us? Can you help us find them? And they get caught by the locals and then brought back to the English. And the English have these discussions. Well, should we buy them back? Right? Here's the price they're being offered to us at. We can buy them back or we can let them have them. And then, of course, they're relying on local elites, too, to make decisions about conflicts or crimes that occur between enslaved people and the local community. So, in all of these cases, the English become incredibly dependent upon local elites, local merchants. These are not necessarily always European merchants in order to facilitate this massive trade. Does that sort of answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. And Amanda, do you want to go ahead?
Hi. Nice to see you, Justin. Congratulations.
Nice to see you.
I also have the book, although it's not in my hands, it's on my screen, but it's right here. Congratulations. So
Is it available? Is it available online? No.
Yeah,
Is
I
it available?
mean,
Oh, okay.
I'm looking at it via my
That's
library.
great. That's great. Okay. Fantastic.
It's right
Nice to
there.
know. Yeah.
So I was hoping you would tell, of course, like I'm interested in the chapter on disease, race, and slavery, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about fevers and why you chose to think about fevers in particular, as opposed to maybe like skin conditions or gout or any of the other kind of
Sure.
diseases that seem to characterize interactions and engagements between enslavers and enslaved people in this period. And before you answer, I just want to say kudos and thumbs up from me in terms of tackling a different topic for the second book, as I've followed the same thing. And it's really, it's so hard, right? It's so hard. And it's also very humbling in a lot of ways to have to do that. But I also,
but fun.
It is, I mean, hard to talk about fun when you're talking about the British Atlantic sometimes, but
Sure.
I think that it is like, it's driven by a sense of curiosity and need. And I think that that's really important. So yeah, I fully support that.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.
So there was a lot of emphasis, as we all know, for many years, people like Curtin, on one of the reasons why the English and Europeans in general had turned to slavery in the Americas was that there were these fevers, malaria and yellow fever, that had driven that change. And that African people or people born in West Africa, not African people born in West Africa were more likely to survive those fevers than people born simply because they'd grown up in that tropical environment. And it struck me that so I had two things going on. Number one, I said, all right, if we look across the empire at all these places in which yellow fever and malaria and dengue to a lesser extent are common, particularly falciparum malaria, we see vast majorities of slaves, especially by 1700. So this does seem to be happening, at least what Curtin's describing. And it seems to be happening beyond the Caribbean context. And so I published an initial paper in Early American Studies on sort of turning again to this thesis, saying, let's re-examine this. And let's not entertain this sort of biological determinism. Let's think about how it shapes English ideas about the empire. And let's look at what the English are saying and what they're afraid of. And everywhere I look across this tropical empire, and again, they're sort of inventing the tropics, they're saying they're afraid of fevers. They're saying they're afraid of those fevers in those regions. Well, what are those fevers they're afraid of and what's going on? And so, I toyed with the idea of broadening this out and thinking about other diseases in general, but it seemed to me that the great fear in the sources I was reading was fevers. It seemed to me that, yes, people were dying of fevers. And it struck me that the key difference between the tropics and other zones was these incredibly lethal fevers. We're going to see smallpox all across the English Empire. We're going to see other diseases all across the English Empire. But what's unique to the tropics? What separates out this zone from elsewhere? Well, again, it's yellow fever, interestingly, not in Asia. I mean, that's what's quite striking. Dengue maybe keeps yellow fever from developing in Asia, but you see the spread of these of malaria everywhere. And then, what's even more striking is that as you see the globalization of forced labor, these fevers seem to get worse. I don't know if that's perception or not. I talk about that a little bit in the chapter, but it strikes me that what's happening is an expansion of falciparum malaria, which is endemic in West Africa, around the globe, an unwitting expansion. And then I talk in that chapter how that really interesting this is because it shapes their understanding of race fundamentally. And it doesn't mean that there is this sort of essential biological difference, because the English are confused often what they're encountering. They're imagining differences that aren't there. So the best example they give is of Madagascar. The Malagasy people from Madagascar are brought into the Indian Ocean, and the English and the Dutch argue that they will survive better in the Indian Ocean than Europeans because they describe them as African. They're that sort of common label of, quote, Negroes. Everyone in Africa is. But the remarkable thing with the Malagasy is they wouldn't have had very much exposure to malaria at all, especially where they're coming from. So the enslaved people of Malagasy are coming from the highlands, from the interior. And there's no recorded malaria there until the 19th century. And so these people are being shipped out to the Indian Ocean under this assumption that somehow all Africans share, all Black people share this kind of common immunity to fevers, and then they're dying in droves in the Indian Ocean. And so this misunderstanding of these biological processes plays out in hugely consequential ways and disturbing ways, and informs the creation of this idea of race. So it's me trying to weave this argument back into the literature on some level, but make it more nuanced and understand that it's not necessarily always what's happening. That there's an interaction between the biological realities of people developing immunity in a certain disease context, but also the perceptions and awareness of it. And it comes down to this: the English can choose to migrate or not. Enslaved people don't choose. And so the English can say, all right, we're going to force you here. And and that's forced migration is one of the things I talk about as a critical element of slavery. We don't have to go there. And it strikes me the English start avoiding these hot places because they see how quickly everyone's dying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Really excited to read it in more detail.
I'm really excited to have you read it. Reach out to me. Yeah.
Congrats again.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Amanda. And do we have any other questions? You can either raise your hand or type it into the chat and I'll read it. And so while we wait for more questions, I'll ask a real quick practical question.
Sure.
When you were talking about sort of, this, like, I think everyone has probably experienced this, especially after COVID, right? This massive documents that you bring back and then you have to sort through. What did you do? Was there a particular maybe like program you used or system, or how did you actually work through those systematically, randomly,
Took a long time. What I did in part, as Dexnell knows, is I chose some specific case studies. I said, okay, I can't deal with all of this. I came back with extensive imagery from places all over the Indian Ocean. And I said, okay, I'm going to look at a few years, a few periods of time. So for example, along the Coromandel coast of India around Madras, I thought I'm going to look at famine times, because during famine times, I know traditionally along the east coast of India, there are a lot of people bought and sold, right? There are families selling their family members into slavery. And that's been happening along that coast for a long time. And I thought, all right, the English are probably going to take advantage of that. So let's figure out, number one, when the famine years are, and let's start with the famine years. And then it's me scanning through and skimming through these Indian office company records, because I've just got photographs. I'm going through one. All I see is my hand there holding down the page over and over and over again. But what's striking about the Indian office records, and I was really stunned by this. Someone at some point in time went through them and drew pencil marks highlighting the sections on slavery. I don't know when that happened. I think it's much older. But someone was already interested in this a long time ago. And so, I was able to catch a number of references simply because of that, because someone had gone through these records with a pencil, apparently, in the British Library, and had penciled their notes in, or maybe before the British Library.
Oh, very interesting. All right, Dane, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. Just a quick question about fevers. I don't know anything about the early modern period, but my general sense was that the British and other Europeans would argue that when they went to the Caribbean and so on, that yes, they would get fevers and some of them would die, but there would be a period of seasoning, and afterwards they were fine. Which is a view that clearly changes by the 19th century. But are you seeing that this changes earlier, or what's the relationship between your view that they're starting to avoid these tropical areas and the view that, well, we can adapt to this after seasoning?
So there's all sorts of arguments I see being made by English physicians that people just need to live better on the tropics and they won't die. Right. Somehow they drink less and eat less, that they'll be fine. But you also see, the death rates from seasoning seem to be going up, or death rates during seasoning. And yes, undoubtedly, that's when most of them are dying. The death rates seem to be going up if you look at some of the records along the West African coast, for example. And so I think this just becomes a deterrent. You know, the reality is it's fine. You can adapt to that environment, but the risk of adaptation is so high. Why would you go? And so, you know, this is where it gets really interesting because, you know, I've had talks with people where they discount, for example, Curtin's argument, and they say, well, listen, you know, blacks and whites died at the same rate in the Caribbean or in West Africa. All you have to do is look at the 18th century and the 19th century. And I said, well, maybe they did by that point, because at least in the Caribbean, because by that point, everyone had been seasoned and a significant portion of the populations were born in the Americas. And so they were all growing up in the same disease environment. But in that early period of globalization, when you have, you know, Europeans born in Europe coming to the Caribbean, you have Africans born in the West Coast of Africa coming to the Caribbean, that early period, I think, you know, the death rates are substantial. I think people are aware of that. They're witnessing that. And I think they're afraid of it. And I think that keeps them from going. I think they're all very aware of seasoning. They are. And I think they become more aware of seasoning over time. But I also think the risk of seasoning grows, and it's growing because this falciparum malaria is spreading everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Dane. We probably have time for one more quick question if anyone has anything pressing they would like to ask. No? All right.
I'd like to ask a question.
Go ahead, please.
Dexnell, what do you make of my definition of slavery? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think it's a helpful definition. I'm thinking about, is it Stanley Engelman and the Cambridge history of slavery, I think, and they talk about these kind of gradations or scales of kind of coercive labor and so on, right? And I mean, of course, I think it's very important to make this very clear distinction between slavery, or the kind of distinct form of kind of racialized slavery that was concretized in the Caribbean. So, I mean, I'm very much in agreement. From it. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, you have discussions even here when we transition even beyond, you know, slavery in the Caribbean to indentureship, and people talking about a new kind of slavery. And I mean, coercive labor definitely is a kind of broad category that we should be thinking about. But even so, that is very distinct from the system of slavery that emerges in the Caribbean. So yeah, I'm in agreement.
Helen, if you want to go ahead real quick with a question.
Yes, thank you very much. I just coming back onto the definitions of slavery, I was curious if you saw any distinction between enslavement of the body and then enslavement of the soul. So I look at particularly the difference between Protestants and Catholics, and I find a lot of English Protestants are particularly obsessed with the idea of being enslaved to Romish superstition, so on and so forth. And then how that's interacting with potentially other religions within these tropics region that I think you make a really compelling argument for having to take that broader view of circulating knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't seen anything on enslavement of the soul, but I definitely see a shift towards, or a shift away from religious justifications of slavery and towards race over the course of this period. That's one of the things I'm trying to trace and explore, is to say, okay, we want to think about the ways in which someone is considered as not belonging or as an outsider. And religion is one of the ways in which that's one of the categories of difference that's used. So, you know, we think that, you know, for example, as I said, you know, the Mughals say, well, you can't enslave Muslims. You just can't. And the English argue at several points that you can't enslave, you know, the English, and partly because they're, you know, by the end of the 17th century, partly because they're Protestant. You can't enslave Protestants. You know, one of the great examples of this I saw, just sort of quickly, was that there's an East India Company site that sends back a letter to to London, to the directors, and they say that they have enslaved a man for committing crimes, because this is one of the categories they understand that you can use for justifying enslavement. They admit that the man is English. And London writes back a letter, and they're furious that the local merchants have enslaved an Englishman. And they say, you cannot enslave an Englishman. No one of our nation can be enslaved. And then there's some discussion, as I remember in that letter, of Protestantism, but the key was, you know, no one of our nation can be enslaved. But yeah, I mean, certainly there's religious justifications for enslavement, occurring all throughout the 17th century. This is one of the big things you see in Barbados with sort of the Irish Catholics and the justification for, not so in that case. And again, I want to make it clear, I do not think the Irish were slaves in this context. It's one of the things I wrote the book to prove, but the Irish became more vulnerable in that context because of their religious differences. So things could be done to them that you couldn't necessarily do to non-Catholics. And that's one of the things I try to stress in the book, is that when we think about the continuum of slavery and other forms of labor or other forms of bondage, is that, we want to think about it as a continuum of vulnerabilities in certain contexts and positions, and what makes someone vulnerable, what makes someone eligible for greater degrees of dehumanization or control, or denial of rights and freedoms and so on. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. And I hope that you will all join me in thanking Justin and Dexnell for this wonderful conversation today.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate that. And please feel free to email me if there's any questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, and hope to see you all at another event. All right.
All right. Take care.